Morning. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started this morning. So this morning we're going to be looking at chapters 12 and 13 of 1 Samuel. So if you want to go ahead and turn over there in your Bible. I will have quite a few of the scriptures up on the screen, but in case you want to follow along. When I found out the quarter was going to be talking about 1 Samuel, I was intrigued by that because I think there's a lot of material to work with, let's just say, in this book. You have the whole, the birth and the rise of Samuel, but to me, the whole arc of the story of Saul is just a fascinating story to me. You may remember back high school literature or college literature, but you have the concept of like a tragic hero or a tragic character. And some of those obviously, come from Shakespeare. So you have Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth would be a great example of a tragic hero, or Oedipus from ancient Greek literature. And that idea of a tragic hero is somebody that has these noble qualities about them and maybe starts out on the right path, but then unfortunately is kind of undone by some flaw that they have, and they end up becoming this tragic character. Now, I'm a pretty simple person. This is kind of highbrow literature to me when you talk about Shakespeare. But I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. And when I think of tragic heroes, I think of the character I have here from the film, Boromir, who many of you may not know anything about the Lord of the Rings books by J.R. Tolkien, but it's probably my favorite series of books. But Boromir is kind of one of these tragic heroes in the books because he's this son of a nobleman. He's very, militaristic warrior. And he's this tragic hero because he first tries to convince the hero Frodo, and if you don't know the characters, that's okay, to give him the ring of power to fight the evil Lord Sauron. And he decides that the only way to do that is through force, so he decides to try to physically take that from Frodo. Frodo ends up escaping. Boromir then regrets this rash decision that he made. Ultimately, he does die, but he does kind of redeem himself by saving Frodo and some of the other characters in the book. But I love his character, but because it does exemplify kind of that idea of somebody that has these noble characters and then yet ends up kind of as a failure. And I can't think of a more tragic character possibly in the Bible than Saul. You could probably maybe find somebody else. Judas would probably be another one. Somebody that seemed to maybe have it together or was selected by God to, have some specific role, and then yet is a complete failure at that. And the idea of Saul, which is really the remainder of 1 Samuel that we're going to be studying this quarter, a lot of it's going to focus on Saul and that dynamic with David. And it's a fascinating dynamic. But I always found Saul to be this tragic character because here was somebody that was selected by God to lead his people. And yet, as we're going to see this morning, I'm jumping ahead a bit, you know, the whole arc of Saul's career, let's just say, comes on the scene quickly. You know, we saw that last week when Mike was teaching. Becomes anointed king, and yet it's just this very quick rise, and what we're going to see starting today is a very quick fall, and it's just a tragic character. But before we get into Saul, we're going to take a look at Samuel in his farewell address. So this is in chapter 12. Now, Samuel's giving this farewell address, and, you know, my first inclination is to think that, you know, well, typically somebody gives a farewell address towards the end of their life. And, well, yes, Samuel was old. He still had a ways to go. He's still going to factor into a number of the chapters that we're going to see going forward this quarter. But this is the point, kind of a reminder of last week, right? Saul has been anointed king. The people wanted a king. God said, you know, hey, look, Samuel, it's okay. They've rejected me, but go ahead and do it. Go ahead and give them a king, and here's who it's going to be. So Samuel is, in this address, he's kind of, I guess, fading away as far as the civic duty, but he's still going to play a role in both priest and prophet. So the first part of chapter 12 is we're going to look at Samuel's integrity. All right, so I'm going to read some of this. So Samuel gets up in front of Israel, and we were told that when Samuel approached God about the people wanting a king, you know, God, as I said, God kind of reassured Samuel and said, you know, it's me that they've rejected. But I have to think that there was a part of Samuel that was disappointed, hurt, whatever it might be, whatever you might want to call it, that the people were clamoring for a king during his time as judge to the nation of Israel. And I think you're going to see that in the way he makes some statements here. So let's go ahead and read this. So Samuel is in front of the nation of Israel. Here I am. Testify me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I defrauded, or whom have I oppressed? For whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you. And as I mentioned, I get the feeling, you know, looking at this and reading this, that there is a frustration maybe with Samuel and this idea that the people wanted a king. Maybe, you know, Samuel was hoping that the transition would go to his sons. But we already found out last week when the people were wanting a king that Samuel's sons did not walk in his way. They took bribes, perverted justice. I almost get the feeling here that Samuel is kind of making this statement as maybe a little bit of a contrast to maybe that idea of his sons not walking in his light. He's very clear here, you know, I'm right here. Tell me, give me evidence. When have I ever done anything to pervert justice? And if I did, I'll restore it. The people respond. They say, you've not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from a man's hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that if you have not found anything, in my hand. And they say, he is witness. They're saying yes, before God. You're correct. You have not defrauded us or perverted justice. So how can we make potential application of this? Well, I'm going to state the obvious, but sometimes it's worth stating the obvious. True success requires integrity. You know, the way the world views success many times, Ryan kind of alluded to this a bit in his sermon. You know, power, prestige, wealth. You know, the way the world defines success is very different than the way God defines success. And it's not that wealth or power or prestige, it's not that any of those things are bad things in and of themselves, right? But how you get there matters. And you have to get there with integrity. And so many times in the world, those things are required through the exact opposite, a complete lack of integrity. Success can't just be handed down, or integrity can't be handed down. And what I mean by that is this, is that, you know, as a parent, and I have great children, don't take this to, you know, say that I don't. But, you know, I can't hand down integrity or success to my children and say, here you go, I've had this, I'm going to give it to you, and they're just going to take it and go with it, and now they've got it, right? Now, we can do things as parents to instill these values in our children, right? And hopefully they're going to take that and run with it. But at the end of the day, it is up to them to do it. And I'm reminded that there's this contrast between Eli and his sons. And if you remember back from the first lesson this quarter, we found out that Eli's sons were not good people. And here we've got almost in a similar situation with Samuel, where Samuel's this great person of integrity, and yet his sons don't walk in his way. And what a tragic that is, that, you know, that as great an example as Samuel was, apparently his sons completely blew that off. And it was just a reminder to me that, and it's painful sometimes, you know, as parents, that you can't just give that to your children and say, all right, you've got it, go with it. They have to take that up. Every generation has to take that up and run forward with it. Success often means, you know, seeking feedback from others. That can be a bit painful. I'm sure, or at least I feel, that when Samuel got up before Israel, he was probably pretty confident in what he was about to say, that he, you know, did not defraud anyone. But on the other hand, to get up in front of the entire congregation of Israel and make that bold proclamation that, hey, look, if you can give me any evidence or give me evidence that I have defrauded anyone, I'll make restitution for that. He's putting himself out there. And I think it's important, especially as leaders, to be able to get that kind of feedback from others. I see this in the business world, where, you know, where I work, we have, obviously you have ways to get feedback from your immediate supervisor, but there's also ways to get feedback from people that maybe you interact with and get that candid feedback. I thought, as an example, a gentleman I knew, we were down at a conference that the company puts on, and he was telling me about this public speaking, ironically enough, public speaking course that he had, and how that when you got up in front of the group, every time you would maybe pause or use the or something, you know, they would like make this noise. Like it was they'd give you this immediate feedback of, no, don't do that. And he said that they had even filmed them, and they would take you And they would review the film of your public speaking, and they would sit there and critique it. And after he told me that, I thought, there's no way I'm doing that. I couldn't take that. The lessons in here that we do on Sunday morning are recorded because they're live streamed. I'm not brave enough to go back and watch myself on any of that. I can't deal with it, right? But it's important to be able to take that feedback from others. And I think that's what Samuel is doing here. We're going to move on now to the next section. So in verse 8, Samuel has now said, hey, look, I'm a man of integrity. If not, tell me. And the whole congregation has said, nope, as God is our witness, you are a man of integrity. So now he's going to move on. So Samuel says, when Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot their God. A pattern that we're going to see over and over and over again in the nation of Israel. He goes on. He sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and to the king of Moab. And they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned, but now deliver us out of the hands of our enemies that we may serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hands of your enemies. And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, this is just what's recently happened, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. So how can we make application of this? Well, I think the first one is that God listens to the cries of his people. Maybe no better example of that if you want to think about the Exodus, and that the crying out of the people, I'm sure, was great, and God sends Moses and Aaron to deliver his people and take them out of Egypt. But as Samuel also mentioned, there's other cases, certainly with the judges, right, of which Samuel is the last. It's that same kind of cycle. And again, it's just this like repeat. The people would disobey. They would then have discipline. And then they would have deliverance. And it seems like this cycle just continues over and over again. God is the one that provides deliverance. Notice that Samuel was very clear in that God provided Moses and Aaron, that God provided these judges to do this. God is the one that provides the deliverance. It's not out of your own hands, of your own power, of your own doing. God is always faithful, and I'm sure at times it probably didn't feel that way to the nation of Israel when you look at how many years they spent in slavery in Egypt. The amount of time after Joshua that the judges ruled, and it was, again, that cycle of this repeat cycle, but God was always there for them. They just had to be willing to recognize their sin, confess their sin, and turn away from it. So after this review, Samuel then is going to jump into this admonition that he provides in verse 14. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. And it's interesting to me that he makes that statement that if both you and the king, they are joined together, they are joined at the hip in a manner of speaking, right? The people and this king that they have wanted. But, there's always a but. If you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Which should really be no surprise. They should have, they've experienced this for I don't know how long now, right? This whole cycle. But Samuel is reminding them once again that, if you don't obey, bad things are going to happen. Think of it this way. God is faithful, as we just talked about. His promises have conditions. And there's no better, I think, example of this than what we're seeing here, that God was always there for them. But their success was dependent on whether they were obedient to him and what he asked of them. And if they weren't, they were going to suffer the consequences for that. Which leads to the next point. God disciplines those that he loves, and that's not a pleasant thing. I don't think any of us maybe enjoy discipline. I don't think it's a popular, maybe it's not a popular opinion in the world these days, especially when you think of God. And I kind of spoke a little bit about this a couple weeks ago when I taught. I don't think the world necessarily likes this idea of a God who disciplines. It's much easier for us as humans to want to just kind of hold on to the idea of a God who's just all loving and, I'm just got to, do whatever I can, to be the best person I can or to do whatever's right for me. God's going to love me. That's just not the reality, right? God is going to discipline those that he loves. And he does it for a specific reason, right? It's so that we will become better people, that we will correct course if we're on the wrong course. The other thing I took from this is that success or failure can be a shared experience, right? And I mentioned this, that the king and the people seem to be kind of joined together. Samuel makes that connection. It's like you're either going to rise or fall together. And while it's true that each of us is responsible for our own behavior, for our own salvation in a manner of speaking, even though that's a gift, right, from God through grace. But in some respect, each of us is accountable for our own behavior. On the other hand, we exist in a corporate sense, right? In the church here at Bellevue, we're in this together. And in some ways, our success or failure as a congregation, we're tied together in this. It's not just the elders or the ministers or the teachers. It's the congregation and the leaders. They both have to be working together, pulling in the same direction in order to have success. So wrapping up chapter 12 on Samuel's farewell address, I was thinking, this reminds me of a few other farewell addresses, Moses and Joshua. There's similarities and differences between their addresses that they make. One of the similarities is they're both, or all three of them, are in a time of transition. So you have Moses handing the reins over to Joshua. And a lot of this you'll see towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy. You have Joshua turning the reins over to the judges. And now we have Samuel in this time of transition turning over the civil authority over to a king. Yeah, that's not going to show up probably real well. But it did get me to thinking of these three different farewells. So you have Moses, and one of the main themes that Moses had here was, God's present and encouragement. And to me, the key verse there is Deuteronomy 31:6, where Moses tells them, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God that goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. And obviously in that context, Moses preparing the people for Joshua going into and conquering the land of Canaan. In Joshua, it's this covenant choice or personal example, right? So in Joshua 24:15, Joshua makes this well-known statement. Choose this day who you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua knows that he is getting ready to die, and that it's going to be turned over into more of a, maybe not a strong central figure, more of a, the judges and everyone kind of doing their own thing. But he's encouraging them to remain faithful to God. And then in Samuel, it's this idea of integrity, uprightness, gratitude, and then also expressing all that God has done for them. And the key verse there is 12:24, which says, only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. Kind of going back to what he was saying about how that God had given them deliverance, that God was faithful to them. They needed to remain faithful to God. All right, moving along. We're going to turn to chapter 13 now and start to get into Saul. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, the rise and fall of Saul is in some ways quick. He comes up quick and then fails quick. Now, his reign does extend, I think, for about 20 years. But as we're going to see here, his failure is quick and complete. But first off, it's not all bad. We have a victory to look at. So starting in verse 1, Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, so this is very early into the reign of Saul, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. And if you remember correctly, I think it's in 1 Samuel 11, that there were over 300,000 that had volunteered. And yet here we have Saul kind of bringing everything down to just 3,000. I don't know if these 3,000 were like the elites, or if they were maybe also from the tribe of Benjamin. They were loyal, maybe extremely loyal to Saul, not really sure. But for whatever reason, Saul decides he only needs these 3,000. Jonathan, Saul's son, and this is the first mention that we have of Jonathan, who's going to play a large part in the remainder of 1 Samuel. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard it was said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were called out to Saul at Gilgal. Pointing out something pretty obvious here. Who defeated the Philistines in this example? Jonathan. But what is this in verse 4? And all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines. I don't know. Is that just the way it's worded here? Did somehow things get confused and people were hearing that Saul had defeated the Philistines when in fact it was Jonathan? Or possibly did Saul want to promote himself, and even though it was his son that really had the victory, he wanted to promote himself, so made it declared out that he was the one that had defeated the Philistines. We're really not sure. I'd like to give Saul the benefit of the doubt, but as we're going to see throughout the rest of this quarter, that might be a little bit generous to give him the benefit of the doubt. So making application of this, trying to be aware of the time because I know we had a little bit shorter time today. Success isn't about numbers. And we've seen this before in Scripture. I think of Gideon. But for whatever reason, whether it was overconfidence in Saul, thinking he didn't need the initial 300,000 that had volunteered and only needed 3,000, or if he just had his faith rightly placed in God, knowing that that's where the victory was going to occur, that it wasn't about the large size of the army, regardless, success isn't based on numbers. Leaders always need to give proper credit. And whether that's in spiritual matters or even in the business world, doesn't matter. Whether Saul intentionally didn't give the credit to Jonathan or not, I'm not sure. But it's absolutely true that leaders give credit to the people that do the work and don't take it for themselves. At least leaders that are going to be successful long term. Showing boldness can be infectious. So Jonathan boldly goes in and defeats this garrison of the Philistines, and it seems to kind of rally the people to Saul. And success can be infectious, but it can also alert those that oppose us. And we'll see here that what happened is as soon as this happened, the Philistines were like, we can't have this. These uppity Israel and their new king, we're going to put them back in their place. And in spiritual matters, I think this is just as true. When you show boldness and courage and you start having success in spiritual things, Satan is going to be there. He's going to take notice, and he's going to try to do whatever he can to thwart that. So unfortunately, that's pretty much the highlight for Saul, I think. It's kind of a slow downhill from this point on. So we're going to read on. As I mentioned, the Philistines, when they saw this, that Jonathan had conquered this garrison, they muster up to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand of the sea, shore in multitude. All right, so they're alerted to this fact. And when the men of Israel see this, right, they know they're in trouble. The people hid themselves in caves, holes, rocks, tombs, and cisterns. Some even crossed the ford of the Jordan to try to get away. And even those that stayed with Saul were like trembling in fear. So hard times are here, right? The Philistines are alerted, and they are about ready to try to put a world of hurt on the Israelites. So Saul waits 7 days. This is something that had been planned about a long time ago. Saul waits 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offerings. Big mistake. As soon as he finished this, Samuel comes up, right? And Saul goes out to greet him almost, you kind of get the idea that Saul here is almost like, yeah, hey, Samuel, it's no big deal. Samuel immediately confronts him. What have you done? Saul says, when I saw the people were scattering from me and that you did not come with the days appointed, and the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. One thing I notice here with Saul is when he's confronted by Samuel, instead of maybe being upfront and repentant, whether that would have changed the course of his kingdom, I don't know. But what does he do? Well, the people were scattering. You didn't show up when you were supposed to. Well, the Philistines, look at them. They're coming up against us. I had to do this. I had to force myself to do this. So he's offering all these excuses about why he did exactly what he was commanded not to do. Samuel had already commanded him a few chapters ago to wait for him. He would do the burnt offering, and he would say what was supposed to happen next. Samuel breaks the bad news to Saul. You have done foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord. For the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has commanded him to be the prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded. All right, I'm going to have to go through this pretty quick because we're already at time. Obedience is paramount, right? Whether Saul had good intentions or not, he was not supposed to offer the burnt offering, and he did it anyway. And he's going to pay the price for it. He apparently didn't seem to want to accept any of the blame for this. He wanted to look at others, offer up excuses. He acted impatiently and took matters into his own hands, which is not a good thing to do. And disobedience has serious consequences. In some ways I think, okay, Saul had one failure here. It was early on in his kingdom. Could he not have somehow still had some type of redemption? For me as a human, it seems like that maybe that was still an option. But I have to remind myself that God sees the heart. He knows what's really going on. And obviously God had seen enough at this point and realized this guy is not the one. I'm going to find somebody after my own heart. So the conclusion of this, I would say, is that it's kind of almost like you've got two chapters that are maybe mirrors of each other. Samuel and the integrity, talking about, obedience, following God. And then in chapter 13, you have Saul doing the exact opposite. Only 2 years or so into his reign, and he's already made a fatal mistake to the point where God had said, I'm done. Now, the kingdom's going to go on for a little bit longer before ultimately David comes in, but God's done. It's just a tragic story to me how quickly Saul comes into the scene and yet how quickly he falls. So, apologize for going a little bit later, but that's all for today.